I'm Pippa Malmgren, and this is Real Visionaries. My work now, it's really interesting. It's no longer one job. It's a kind of portfolio of interests. So I'm working with something called the Monaco Foundry, which is a VC accelerator incubator for small startups based out of Monaco, but with a global portfolio and a global team of senior partners. And that is quite amazing because it puts me at the cutting edge of what's happening in technology and innovation and all these little companies that are creating extraordinary results. So that's a lot of fun. I still do a huge amount of public speaking, and that keeps me embedded with the sort of traditional finance community and major corporations, companies like Google and American Express. And that's cool because I get to hear what their thinking is about the state of the world and find out what people don't know. There are a lot of traditional finance people who really don't know very much about DeFi, for example. So that's a big learning space for me. I have a column now on Substack where I'm using that technology to write in public. So my first serious book, Signals, I crowdfunded because that was the cool cutting edge technology at the time. Today, it's writing your book in public on Substack. So then you get feedback from the audience all the time, which makes your arguments stronger. My dad was such a huge mentor to me and still is to this day. And he had been the chief trade negotiator for the United States, and he'd been economic advisor to 4 presidents and many prime ministers and leaders around the world. So I kind of got an apprenticeship at an early age, and he made it fascinating and just so interesting and taught me stuff like, the difference between the front page of the Washington Post story versus what actually happened, which is crucial if you want to understand what's going on in the world economy. And a passion for the travel and going and seeing what's going on where and who's doing what and what's the actual story versus what do you think is happening. I actually thought I was not going down that path because I decided to go into finance. And back in that era, this is, the 80s, finance was not considered economics, right? That was a different field altogether. But once I got into finance and I was running strategy for some of the biggest investment banks in the world, I realized, well, actually, economics and public policy is so at the heart of all the decision making. So I've always been right at that nexus between policy and markets. That's my space. And I don't know, I kind of developed an interesting skill set, which is sounds funny, but I speak both Klingon and Federation. I can explain the market guys to the policymakers and vice versa, because they don't really talk to each other very well. It was wonderful having the opportunity to work for President George W. Bush. But I met him when he was still governor, and I was asked to go brief him, and that's how it began. He was beginning to assemble his team of advisors. Larry Lindsay, who was his economic advisor, knew me and my work very well. We used to confer a lot. I'm in Japan. What are you hearing? Well, I'm in Paris. This is what I heard. And so he said, would you come to Austin and brief the governor? I'm like, yeah, of course, definitely. So I got on a plane, we hit it off, and he asked me to be involved in the campaign. And not that, the international economy was such a crucial part of that, but it was fun to be part of that team. And then he won. And I was offered the one role that was so extraordinary, which was being in charge of all financial market issues for the president. Although little did I know what I was stepping into, because then we had 7 of the 9 largest bankruptcies in American history in 1 year. That was Enron, Tyco, WorldCom, and all that. And of course, we were still recovering from the dot-com bubble bursting at that point. And then we had 9/11. And so I worked on terrorism risks to the economy after 9/11 as well, in addition. So it was an unbelievable life experience and a real privilege to be asked to work. My advice to anyone who is asked by any president is you should give that a go. You should, serve your country. I don't follow markets the way I used to. When I was an investment banker, I used to follow dollar yen, and I used to follow where's the bond market and where's the stock market. I still keep an eye on those things, but it's with my peripheral vision. Now I'm really interested in who's creating tomorrow. And that means being involved with these small startups that are undertaking extraordinary technological innovations. And I see them being the solution to the meta problems of our time, by which I mean things like getting fresh water to everybody on the planet, eliminating carbon from, CO2 from our atmosphere. It's not going to be big corporations that actually do this. It's little tiny innovators that come up with game-changing ways of tackling these massive problems that affect us at every level, literally the planetary level down to the family level. And so I spend a lot of my time listening and learning from that community. And I think there's a new trend coming, which is increasing investment into ever smaller companies. And this has been kind of the privileged play area of the private equity world. But I think that it's about to be democratized. It's such a privilege to be asked to do this interview series. And I'll be talking to some phenomenal people that I've met in my career that I just think are so interesting to hear from. So one of them is John Cropper, who has done so many things. It's hard to say even where to begin. But most recently, he was the brand design genius at Aston Martin. But early in his career, he's one of the first guys at MTV. Quincy Jones was his mentor, and he ran Quincy Jones's companies for him. He is a genius who was named the best marketer in America under the age of 40.
In the middle of what I call the triple pandemic that we're dealing with now, which is an environmental one, a biological one with COVID, and a cultural one with what I'll call the cultural divide driven by hyper-conservative separatist attitudes. So we have these three pandemics all happening at the same time, which traditionally would make you feel that the future is gray and not very bright. I think that the future is insanely bright and insanely optimistic, because just as there's always dark and difficult times, that's usually when human creativity expands. And you don't have to go too much farther than the research and development labs of the coolest companies and governments and the universities. And some of the, being privileged to have the chance to look inside, peek behind the wall, around the corner, and see the future while it's being developed. Man, we're getting close to some big time solutions.
He has an ability to detect a zeitgeist, where things going, like nobody I know. Kelli Richards is like a national treasure. She literally started working with Steve Jobs when she was 16 and became the brains behind the launch of music at Apple, which ultimately culminated in iTunes. We would not have that without her.
People think there wasn't anything before iTunes at Apple with music. But I actually burst the focus of music and entertainment at Apple in the late 80s, in my 20s. And so I was responsible for making sure that every filmmaker and every musician used a Macintosh as a creation tool. So first we focused on creation and then focused on distribution with digital, and that's where iTunes came in, consumer facing. So I handled making sure I laid the foundation for the industry attaching themselves to the Mac platform, and then we turned the lens to the consumers with iTunes.
And she's worked with every major musician, Bowie, Prince, Todd Rundgren, but critically at the juncture of high tech and music and entertainment, which of course today is so crucial. If you want to be investing in DeFi, you need to understand the nexus between these things. And she's just brilliant at that. The Fernandez brothers are just extraordinary. They are twins, and sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. But one of them, Alex, is based in Las Vegas. And 20 years ago, he decided to create a company to be in the metaverse and to help businesses enter the metaverse. An incredible visionary. And that business has been hugely successful from day one. And they're one of the biggest makers of games. So if you want to know about gamification and what's possible in the gaming space, he's your guy. But his twin brother, Hector, is based in Tokyo, where he is the key person at Sony PlayStation acquiring games.
Everything is better when it's a game. Loyalty points, air miles is money is the original game, honestly. Yeah. So that whole process of being able to sit there and actually create a core loop that makes someone interested in playing with aligned incentives that at every right moment gives you the hit of dopamine that makes you want to continue. It was clear to us that that was already happening. And it was something that we as children had already existed in playing video games, even if people used to do role-playing games with D&D where it was imagination oriented, you could just see how much of the psychology and behavioral analytics that were occurring within this field, what value it would have everywhere else.
He has an extraordinary view over the landscape of gamification and game creation. And again, these things are at the heart of where profitability and future revenues are coming from for almost every kind of business. So hearing their views is really valuable for investors.